Hi all. My name is Lisa Fernandez, and I'm the Associate Director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here today. Thank you for joining us. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. Thank you for listening to this land acknowledgement of Yale University. Now, I'll turn it over to Tom Murray, our speaker series coordinator and an undergraduate at Yale College. Tom?
Thank you so much, Lisa. So our talk today is sponsored by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication. Here we focus on 4 areas at the Yale University School of the Environment. Firstly, we teach students and we train working professionals. Secondly, we conduct research on environmental attitudes and behaviors. Third, we inform and engage the public through environmental journalism, including our many partnerships, such as with the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, who is co-sponsoring today's event. Here at the YCEC, we also host Climate Connections, a short daily radio story focusing on how people are experiencing and addressing global warming in their daily lives. And that airs on over 680 stations nationwide and is available as a podcast as well. And then fourth, we also support a global network of organizations seeking to build public and political will for environmental solutions. And secondly, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication is the principal research entity under the YCEC, and it's also the home to the Climate Change in the American Mind project. Now, here we conduct twice yearly national representative surveys of public opinion about climate change. We also do message experiments to reveal what forms of communication are able to most effectively engage different strategic audiences. And this is very similar to the work we do internationally. And with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Kayla Edwards of the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, who will be today's moderator.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kayla Edwards from the Pulitzer Center. For those of you who have not joined us for programming before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to elevate public engagement with underreported issues through both the direct support of journalism and through education and outreach programs such as this one. A few logistics before we begin today. If those of you in the audience have questions for today's speakers, please use the Q&A icon on your screen. You can begin adding your questions at any time throughout the remarks as soon as something comes to mind. We'll be moderating questions and repeating them for the speakers to answer. Please note that we've disabled the chat for today's event and note that all attendees are muted. We want to let you know that we will be recording this session to post online on the YPCC website for others who could not join us today. We'll send attendees a link once it's posted. Today, you'll hear from 3 panelists who have or will report on tropical forest carbon. Their work highlights the power of words and photographs in covering carbon issues in the Peruvian Amazon and Costa Rica. We'll get started first with Blanca Begert, recent graduate from the Master of Environmental Science program and the 2020 Pulitzer Center Reporting Fellow from Yale. Now I'll turn it over to Blanca.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kayla. My name is Blanca, and like Kayla said, I'm the 2020 Pulitzer and YPCCC Climate Reporting Fellow. In 2019, I was in Peru working on my master's thesis, and I was supposed to go back in 2020 to report on tropical forest carbon offset projects and how they're experienced on the ground. But because of the pandemic, my project was delayed, so I'm waiting for a safe time to go. So today, I'm going to talk about my thesis research, which was the inspiration for my reporting, and which I conducted as a master's student at Yale, where I just graduated in February. As part of my thesis, I explored a conflict between local communities and the administration of the Altomayo protected forest, which is a protected area in Peruvian Amazonia where the Walt Disney Company purchases most of its carbon credits to offset the emissions from its cruise lines. So this research lays the groundwork for many of the issues that I plan to explore when I go back to Peru. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about political ecology, which is a field of study that influences the way I'm thinking about forest and carbon conservation. And then I'm going to share a story from the Altomayo protected forest. So political ecology is, sorry, back to the slide you were just on. Thanks, is a field that seeks to unravel the political forces at work in environmental access, management, and transformation. It posits that ecological change cannot be understood without considering the political and economic structures within which ecological change is embedded. The field involves the query and reframing of accepted environmental narratives, and it's critical of the concept of win-win solutions. Instead, it reveals winners and losers, hidden costs, and the differential power that produces certain outcomes. Next slide, please. So here are just a few key concepts that run through political ecology research and practice. And to be clear, these ideas do not just belong to this field. Political ecology draws on many disciplines, and as well as from people outside of academia. But these are some core tenets. And one is looking at power relations. So all relationships involve some sort of power dynamic, and political ecology practitioners critically examine the power differential between themselves and their sources, and among stakeholders of conservation projects like governments, businesses, NGOs, and local people. The power differentials influence the way that environmental problems are defined and framed, which in turn will shape proposed solutions. Political ecology also aims to identify broader systems rather than blaming local forces for environmental change. So for example, instead of focusing on the practices of small farmers as the drivers of deforestation, a political ecologist might look at the policies of the government, the global capitalist system, historical processes, and global institutional infrastructures shaping environmental issues. Political ecology might ask what broader forces are driving the unsustainable practices of smallholder farmers, but also importantly, and this gets into the challenging normative assumptions and taken for granted narratives, political ecology would ask if those smallholder farmer practices are actually so unsustainable after all. What does sustainability mean, and who gets to say and who gets to be believed? So there are many more concepts, but next slide, please. All of these ideas and frameworks were helpful for me to have in mind in the summer of 2019 when I went to the Altomayo protected forest. Sorry, next slide, thanks. So the Altomayo is in north central Peru in the department of San Martin. It's co-managed by the Peruvian National Service of Protected Areas and by Conservation International, which I will here refer to sometimes as CI. So the conservation projects in this forest are REDD+ projects, REDD being a climate change mitigation framework developed at the UN Conference of Parties. So REDD carbon projects are essentially forest conservation projects in the global south that are independently audited for how much carbon they sequester, and that are financed for the most part by the sale of forest carbon credits to companies and high emission countries in the global north. And the buyers can use the credits to compensate for their carbon emissions elsewhere in order to meet mandatory or voluntary emission reduction targets. So in Altomayo, the funding that goes to park guards and forest monitoring and conservation work comes primarily from the sale of carbon credits to the Walt Disney Company to offset their cruise ship emissions, as well as from sales to some other US companies. So before I went to the Altomayo, next slide please, I saw a very specific story being told about the carbon offset project there on the Disney and CI websites and on some other blogs and outlets. And the story was something like, the Altomayo protected forest is one of the most biodiverse areas on Earth and a critically important source of clean water. But the arrival of migrant farmers from the Andes due to the construction of a highway through the region has led to rampant forest clearing for unsustainable farming. The tide is turning, though, thank you to innovative carbon market. The story is that carbon financing has allowed the government and NGOs to work with farmers living in the park, signing agreements where farmers commit to not deforest, and in exchange, they get technical assistance to improve their coffee crop yields, to develop sustainable livelihood alternatives like beekeeping, and to be part of a special shade-grown coffee cooperative that sells to luxury markets abroad. So the funders and project staff say this has been a tremendous success, with 600 families currently signed on in the forest, and that deforestation rates have been less than the projected future baseline rates estimated had the project never existed. So it's a win-win for forests, farmers, climate, and companies. Next slide, please. Of course, on the ground in Altomayo, there were people who saw things very differently and stories that diverged from that mainstream narrative. Some farmers had aligned with the park administration, but there were many who had not, including another 600 families or so, or at least half the farmers living in the park who did not sign the agreements. And among those, a very vocal contingent of local farmers who absolutely rejected the park administration, did not recognize their authority in the area, and were engaged in a really serious escalating conflict with the conservation staff. As one example, while I was there, farmers from 12 towns inside the park staged a 4-day blockade on the highway, demanding social services and the removal of a park police base. Many of these were farmers who, because of the park regulations, were not allowed to have electricity and had had health posts and schools removed from their villages. The Altomayo Protected Forest was established in the 1980s, but the regulations weren't really enforced there until around 2008, when CI joined the project and brought in all the carbon offset money. So by then, thousands of farmers had already moved into the park. And in fact, this mass migration to the region, the Amazon region in general, had been encouraged by government policies such as land privatization and the cutting of agrarian subsidies in the Andes, along with the concurrent subsidizing of land and construction of roads and infrastructure in the Amazon, which were meant to expand the agricultural frontier from the 1960s onward. Next slide, please. So the people leading this resistance to the park administration were local chapters of a national organization of peasant community defense groups called the Ronda Campesina, or Peasant Rounds, who have a strong history in Peru of fighting mines and corporate environmental destruction. They told me about how in other parts of the country, they were persecuted for fighting against state-sanctioned US mining companies, which displaced and devastated entire villages. And then in Altomayo, they were being blamed for deforestation and called criminals and illegal loggers, or bad farmers. According to them, they already had their own regulations in place to protect the forest, and they knew how to farm sustainably, and they were the ones best suited to deal with anyone who might break the rules. They didn't have legal title to the land, but they still saw the state as impinging on their property rights and livelihoods, and on their right to self-govern. Some farmers told me that they believed the government had already sold the protected forest to a mining company, and that's why they wanted to get the farmers out of the park. I looked and I did not find any evidence for that. But that said, when you really think about it, next slide, please. There is a US mining company buying carbon credits to fund this project that is interfering in local farmers' lives and in some cases posing the threat of eviction. Lauren Gifford, a critical geography postdoc who studies the carbon market and did some of her PhD in the Altomayo, was interviewed for a radio show and brought up carbon colonialism, where forest carbon sequestration for climate mitigation is privileged above all other forest uses and interests. That seems like one way that you could look at what's going on here, just like you could have rubber colonialism or oil colonialism, you could have carbon colonialism. Next slide, please. So instead of this story reiterating the narrative put out by the conservation organizations or centering on the very localized conflict between the farmers and park administration, as the main event, it can zoom out to what is perhaps a more complete picture of the situation, which includes the story of the mines in the Andes and the roads built for expanding the agricultural frontier and the policies of the government that drove people to move, as well as the visions of the landscape constructed by the farmers and how these clash with the visions constructed by the conservation staff, all visions based on values, assumptions, and past experiences, not just science. The story also becomes a sort of questioning in line with what some local farmers brought up of why do we focus so much on smallholder peasant farmers and getting them to change their practices with these very localized technical farming approaches instead of focusing on hydrocarbon extraction or agribusiness and these more industrial pressures on forests, or just on having fewer Disney cruises. And that's where another one of these key political ecology tenets comes in. What does this have to do with power? Next slide, please. So political ecology isn't just about critique. It explores social environmental changes with an understanding that there are better, less coercive, less exploitative, and more sustainable ways of doing things. To that end, I'm interested in this question posed by the president of the former president of the main national Amazonian Indigenous Federation of Peru. He asked, can RED control industrial destruction, or will it only control the activities of communities and small farmers? So, what if RED could support the Ronda Campesina in their fights against mines and mega dams? There are a lot more issues like this all throughout Amazonia, and it's really important to understand the historical and political context of forest conservation, carbon offset projects on the ground, the assumptions that they're based on. It's important for developing, socially viable and ethical projects to sequester carbon. In some cases might lead us to question the models we're using for forest conservation entirely. Next slide, please. There are researchers and journalists doing great work on this, and I'm grateful to my advisors and classmates at Yale and to all the people in the Altomayo who enabled me to do this research. I really look forward to doing more of my own reporting on this, and I'm very grateful to YPCCC and Pulitzer for the opportunity, and I encourage environmentalists and journalists and anyone in the audience to check out Political Ecology as a resource for thinking about forest carbon stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Blanca. I have already so many questions to ask you during the Q&A, but I just want to, again, tell our audience that if you have any questions for the panelists today, go ahead and put them into the Q&A and we'll ask them in a bit. And so next, I'm going to turn to Dan Grossman, who will be our next speaker. Dan is a Pulitzer Center grantee and the creator of Chronicles Project. Thank you, Dan.
Well, my reporting has to do with climate research and the process of climate research, and you'll see how it ties in with some of it ties in with what Blanca was talking about. Now, we've all seen this chart shown here. It's from the International Panel on Climate Change 2014 report. It shows two possible future scenarios, the red one, which is a worst case, more or less, and then the, which is if we do little to avoid climate change, and the blue one, if we work hard to prevent further warming. Here, go to the next one. And to make such forecasts, researchers don't only consider what humans do. The two lines had to do with humans with what we do. Are we going to work hard to avoid it or not? But in order to actually chart the trajectories, we also have to know what nature does. Humans release carbon dioxide, but there's also a net increase, a net uptake of carbon into the ocean and into vegetation, which is also very important in reducing the amount of, and it reduced that the net uptake that's reduces the amount that actually accumulates in the atmosphere. And I'm going to simplify this complicated diagram in the next picture. As we move from the left to the right, including burning of fossil fuel and deforestation, which is what Blanca was talking about, we have the left arrow, which is how much people contribute to the atmosphere every year. That's 11 billion tons or 11 gigatons of carbon every year. But vegetation, which is the next arrow going down, absorbs 3.4 gigatons and the ocean absorbs 2.6. So on balance, on the right, you see that the amount of carbon going up in the atmosphere is only, well, I shouldn't say only, but is 5.1 gigatons, which is only about half, it's a little less than half of what we released. So these carbon uptakes are critical. But we can't count on the Earth and the ocean to continue to help us out this way. The effects could slow down. For instance, I said that ecosystems take up 3.4 gigaton. That's the difference between photosynthesis, which takes in carbon dioxide, and rotting, which releases it. Now, globally, photosynthesis takes in 120 gigatons of carbon every year, and most of that is balanced out by rotting. So if there's just a few percent change in photosynthesis or rotting, that would significantly affect the amount of carbon uptake. Go to the next slide. Okay. Now there's another factor, which is the carbon stocks. There's another factor that has to be taken into account, which is the carbon stocks, which are amounts of carbon that have been saved up over millennia, and that could start to be released depending on what's going on in the environment. And so as you can see on the left, we have that's the amount, that little teeny black bar is the amount of carbon dioxide the 5.8, the 11 gigatons that we release every year. And that's slowly adding to the amount that's in the atmosphere, which is the blue bar there. But there are huge carbon stocks, which which have the potential to dramatically change how much is in the air. There's a gigantic carbon stock of soil, which is brown. There's all the vegetation, and then there's permafrost. Okay, so my Carbon Chronicles project focuses on research on changes in carbon uptake and release. Okay, now one of the carbon stocks that I focused a lot is on peat. Peat is highly dense, carbon dense soil made primarily of roots that didn't rot. It's preserved by being waterlogged in acidic water. It stores about 21% of Earth's soil carbon, but only on 3% of the land. So it's highly centralized, and therefore it's potentially in great danger. It's something that you want to keep track of. And it's especially of concern in tropical places because it's an attractive place to put industrial plantations of trees such as oil palm and acacia. These plantations need dry soil. So the first step to putting in one of these plantations is draining the peat, which destroys it. So how do you report on something as complex as this in a way that's engaging? Well, in 2019, I reported on a research crew surveying peat in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo may have the largest tropical peat deposit in the world. It competes with another very large tropical peat deposit in Indonesia. And it was a good story for being engaging. I did a story for National Geographic on it because there was a bit of an adventure. There were these scientists that were going into these peat bogs and slogging away and going through deep pools of water and dealing with the difficulties of research there. then I heard about some geographers studying indigenous people, a group called the Urarina, who live on peatlands in Peruvian Amazon. And I thought, well, this would be a pretty interesting story to go see. So go to number 7. The story, just stay there. The story is complex. It turns out that these geographers came up with, or were what these geographers were finding. Boiling it down, young people are increasingly disconnected from the traditions that tie them to their land. They're more interested in becoming part of the market economy than subsistence agriculture and hunting. And I'm not making any judgments here. This is just the finding that what they're noticing. But it raises the possibility that if industrial farmers want to develop this land, it might not be hard for them to get access to it because people are not as tied to the land and as concerned about it as they once used to be. So Dado, who's going to speak next, Dado Galdieri, the photographer, and I traipsed with these geographers in 2 different Urarina villages. And we watched the interviews they did trying to understand people's relationship to the land and what their expectations were about what the future might be for their community. And then the scientists also were doing some surveying, like the ones in the Democratic Republic of Congo, of how much peat was there and where it was and what people used the land for in the peat areas. Now, but how do you turn that into a story? Actually, it was. I mean, it's exciting to be, of course, in the Amazon, as you can imagine, but it was kind of boring. We were just going from house to house, listening to some stories, some of which were hard to understand because they were the people spoke an indigenous language. Their Spanish wasn't that great, and we didn't have a translator with us from Urarina to Spanish, and then there were the repetitious measurements in the peat deposits. Now, of course, I didn't want any of our researchers to anything bad to happen to them, but in the back of my mind, I was kind of hoping that maybe a boat would capsize or we might encounter a snake. And thankfully, for our safety, none of that happened. But when I got back, go to the next slide. I needed to go to the next one, please. I needed to figure out, like, nope, back up. I needed to know what I was, how I was going to drive this story. Could you go back? So I went through my notes and, over and over again, like, what happened? What would be a scene that I would set? And so this is the scene I decided to set, which is just a little bit of tension, a little bit of a question, what's going to happen that might bring people into the story and make them want to continue reading it. So I wrote, last October, Luis Anduesa clambered into a battered motorized dugout canoe in Nueva Union, a village on Peru's Chambira River. The boatman yanked a starter cord and the rusty outboard sputtered to life. "Watch out for snakes," called a villager in Spanish from a dock. "Are there many?" Anduesa yelled back. And that was the what I felt would make people want to know what happened next. Okay, go to the next slide. Nope, back. Yeah. So Dado and I also did a story on how carbon uptake of tropical forests might change, and due to climate change, not due to anything that people might do locally. Tropical forests are one of the places where there's a net uptake of carbon right now, though recent research suggests that's slowing down. Warming temperatures and decreased rainfall are believed to be detrimental to these forests. But some people say that increased carbon dioxide in the air could also protect these trees. So there's another effect of our carbon dioxide would have a protective effect on the trees. Carbon dioxide is a key ingredient for photosynthesis. And so more carbon dioxide in greenhouses makes plants grow better. But how do you do a realistic test of how forests respond to carbon dioxide? That's a very complicated scientific question. So I heard about a team that had a clever idea for how to study this. Volcanoes exude small amounts of carbon dioxide on their flanks from far from the cones. So not up right near the cones where it's hot and maybe poisonous gases are coming out. They just exude carbon dioxide. And the idea was that if the gas in these areas was around the same level you'd expect in the future, because of the gas that we're putting up, you could compare trees and plots with high levels of carbon dioxide with trees and plots where carbon dioxide is not increased by the volcano. Okay, go to the next slide. Again, the process of science, as important as it is, can be repetitive and not too exciting. It was these volcanologists wandering around in the rainforest on the edge of this volcano, measuring carbon dioxide with a device that looks like a cross between a mixing bowl and a bong. And then biologists were using a tape measure to measure trees in the plots to see how big the trees were so they could compare trees in the different kinds of plots and see whether there was a difference in the amount of carbon that was being stored. So when I got back and I looked through my notes, I realized that there was one incident. I was looking for a scene to set. There was one incident that was probably the most dramatic thing that happened on the trip. And it was when we unexpectedly arrived at the base of a cliff that we couldn't scale and we had to turn around. So the way I wrote my story, I started with a kind of a little description of what the exotic jungle looked like. So I wrote, Chad Deering trudges up a dry river channel on the north side of Rincon de la Vieja, one of Costa Rica's active volcanoes. He wears a baseball cap emblazoned with the phrase Semper Fi, a token of his tour of duty with the Marines, and lugs a peculiar apparatus, sort of a sensitive gas testing kit that looks like a metal mixing bowl. Next slide. And then I set up the problem that they were trying to overcome, not the scientific problem, but the problem that might propel us through the story. So I wrote, after explaining a little bit of the science, I wrote, the North Flank team has hit a snag. The riverbed has become a deep canyon that abruptly ends beneath sheer walls. The one woman and 5 men huddle over a computer tablet with a high-resolution map of their intended route. Deering, a volcanologist from Michigan Technical University, stabs a finger swollen with bug bites at a spot tantalizingly close but inaccessible. I want to be here, he says. And so that's how I felt like, okay, we can bring people into the story. And fortunately, I had Dado Galdieri with me, who's going to explain now how he illustrated this with his photographs. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thank you, the Pulitzer Center, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Dado Galdieri, and I'm a Brazilian photographer. Well, what I wanted to say is I am always thankful for Dan for inviting me to this trips. He was the owner of this idea of the Carbon Chronicles, and this is always so difficult for photographers to show these complicated graphs and political concepts in a single or a photo essay that combines all the scientific outreach needs and at the same time is visually compelling. I would like you to move to the next slide, please. That I at some point previous one, that at some time I thought that not this one. At some point I needed to go to a master's degree, and I went. But anyway, my idea and photographs and accompanying scientists and a scientific journalist as Dan, is that I can bring all this emotion that can drive audience to the reports. And to do this, you can give it a play. To do this, I am adding some new technical assets. That's, for example, with Pulitzer, which is not a new thing, but I think it can combine in a very good way with prints and pictures to show from other angles that will kind of show this sense of wonder and urgency that they are trying to convey to the audience. In the end, we are in a hurry, aren't we? So I wanted to also show you guys the two slides. You can move to the next slide. Two slides here. So I'm gonna, next one. I want to show you the process of going through the pictures. I knew that I would have to go to the story of the volcano and the story of showing the concept of wind and CO2 and how to do this. Can you move to the next one, please? Next slide. Yeah. This picture is not a, you can stay for a while. In this first picture, this picture here took me like 2 days to shoot. It's not a very good picture, but it showed at the brief window of time that we had this relationship of the volcano and the tropical forest. You can move to the next one, and you can start moving to the next slides. So what I do is try to put the environment first, and then slowly aggregate the human elements and the scientific elements. You can see the CO2 or other gases escaping and bathing the forest here. And I try to slowly aggregate the scientific and human things until I get to that scale. And with this, I think I get to the point of adding some depth to Dan's report, some visual depth, and trying to put the audience inside or be another part of their crew. You can move to the next. This is the part where Dan mentions in the story. You can move to the next one. Yeah, this is exactly the moment he mentioned in his story. So what we try to do is visually show this complicated concepts that Dan and Blanca try to convey in their extensive pieces on small essays that can have results like the next slide. This is hold on. Yeah, the next slide is New Scientist publication. Yeah, that shows pretty much the story that Dan was telling in a visual manner. I feel that I got short on the drone because the drone broke during this trip, but you will see in the next story. You can move to the next story how it worked. Oh, this is a Washington Post publication on the same story. They used a lot of things, and the next one is the Urarinas that Dan mentioned. And in this story of the Urarinas, you can move next slide. In this story of the Urarinas, what we tried to do was showing how this, underneath carbon, again, it's important, and how would we do that, because it was underneath, right? So maybe what the people do and to protect, and what the people do with their lives with these assets, which is the carbon transformed in their natural resources. This is what I try to focus on. You can move to the next and pass all of them. Yeah. You can go. Yeah. I want to show you guys that the publication resulted in this. You will see in the next slides the whole package of drone footage that I sent in hopes that they will be able to pick one of them and give this sense of wonder and gives this sense of place to the story that Dan was reporting on. If you guys want to, you can go to this publication, which is also on the Pulitzer Center website, and see how they got used. So you have an idea on how it ended up using, or how outlets end up using the all material that we send. Well, that being said, this is the end of my presentation, and thank you all you again for your time.
Thank you, Blanca, Dan, and Dado for your presentations today. We already have some questions in Q&A, but I do want to start by just asking Dan and Dado to speak a little bit more about how you collaborated on the Carbon Chronicles project. What did that process look like for both of you?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that working as a team had many benefits. For one thing, just in terms of the planning and the travel, it was great to have a collaborator. But more importantly, I work my best to explain the science and to find engaging ways to describe it. But great pictures make a story much more interesting and much more engaging. And what I've realized over time is that when I work together with the photographer, and Dado in particular, my stories always get much better play. They'll rather than just being one little let's say a quarter page of a newspaper, it might be a double page spread. And so people really pay attention to it. And that's happened several times. And so, it's very important to having an impact and having people see it. And then the other thing, and Dado will talk more about this, I think, is just we think a little bit differently about what we want to do, and it's really it's eye-opening for me just to see how Dado thinks about it. And he was talking about that getting that picture of the volcano. That was especially eye-opening for me, because I had never really. I always focus very kind of like, okay, I want a scene, I want someone doing something interesting, and he was trying to kind of get the whole story embodied in one picture, and it was very hard to do in the case of the volcano, because it was a crummy volcano, you might say. It didn't look like a volcano, it looked like just some mountain somewhere. And to get the sense of a volcano and the rainforest and the carbon dioxide was a challenge. So Dado, you tell them about your perspective on this.
Yeah, you're right, and I think it was really amazing to pursue this idea, although it didn't work out as I envisioned it, because as we discussed many times, I tend to envision, once I understand the story that Dan is trying to tell, I try to envision which picture is going to resume it, so we can end up with this powerful image. But I don't think it was such a powerful image, although it does sum it up. It has the steam billowing from the volcano. it has the volcano and the slopes of it covered in the tropical rainforest. So yeah, this kind of collaboration, it's to me is very grateful, because Dan gives me a lot of scientific information that I don't have, and that otherwise I would never have thought of. So that's why I was joking around, but yeah, it's true. I needed a master's degree to get along with Dan. So yeah, here I am doing it.
Thank you both. And now, though, I want to ask a question to Blanca. Blanca, you presented a bit on your master's degree research, which you're now also preparing to actually do reporting in Peru. Can you tell me a little bit about, give me a very quick pitch without giving away the entire story of what you're actually hoping to report on, and why you thought it was important to kind of move outside of the academic space into the journalism industry and world to tell this story?
Sure. Thanks. So in terms of the reporting that I will do, it's evolving somewhat. I mean, the basic idea is to cover similar types of projects in Peru where there are these carbon offset projects and some sort of friction on the ground around them, which, because I think, like those frictions are useful for kind of revealing some sort of truth about these stories. But but I'm also still sort of doing some preliminary reporting and figuring out like how to how kind of COVID fits into this and changes the story of some of these forests as well. And then in terms of transitioning to doing more reporting instead of academic research, I just think that the carbon market and forest conservation and forest carbon sequestration are really big topics. They're a major way that we're approaching climate change mitigation, and they're done by, international accord, and there continue to be, new major commitments and massive dollar amounts committed to REDD+. And so I think, it's just an important issue to report on. I mean, there's tons of different discourses out there about these and different perspectives, and there's everyone kind of interacts with carbon offsets whenever we buy something. Practically, we're like also planting trees or whatever. So it also like relates to our like industries here in the global north. And I think it's also a sort of a complicated topic. So I want to be able to communicate these stories with infused, like the lens. I want to be able to communicate these stories through the, lens and frameworks of political ecology to a wider audience, because these are issues that affect us all.
Yeah, even the presentation that was based in some of your academic research was so engaging. So I am especially excited to see kind of what reporting comes out of it too.
Thank you.
Dado, I have another question for you before we probably turn it next to about 10 minutes of questions from our audience. But Dado, one question we were talking about kind of in our prep was also, so the tone of some of the images. We talk about, I know the Yale program of climate change communication probably thinks about, how do you choose or talk about certain images and what messaging is going to be most effective for your audience. So I was wondering if you ever struggled with, having kind of a happy tone versus a kind of a tone that demonstrates the urgency of some of these issues. How, when you were thinking about, well, how do I frame this volcano? Is the volcano something that's, a negative kind of, scary force in this story, or how do you frame it as just a part of this conversation? So I'm wondering how you address or think about the tone of your images.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the volcano as a character, because this is the way I feel it. It's as a character in a complicated system that affects us all or demonstrates something to us. So in that particular story, of course, I wanted to show a volcano that is somewhat sad, because he's spewing some warnings to us. So yes, of course that there is these considerations about the tone being on a balance between the urgency and the real side of the story that we need to tell, which is a sad story. We are depleting our planet from resources through CO2 spewing, and yeah, that needs to be addressed and in shape of image. I don't know if I got that clear, but yeah.
No, definitely it was. So we have just a little under 10 minutes for audience questions. So I'm wondering if Eric Fine from YPCCC might read some of the questions that we've gotten from our audience.
Blanca, the first one is for you from Robin. And Robin says that your reporting is super and thanks you for it. And talks about the comment from the former Indigenous leader that you mentioned. Why can't Disney do fewer cruises? And says that this is the crux of carbon colonialism. And this isn't discussed in global fora. Did you hear this angle from other ronderos?
Well, thanks, Robin, for the question. So just to clarify that, why can't Disney do fewer cruises? That I don't think that was. I think I just said that, and other people have said that. But the ADASEP former leader of ADASEP, I don't think said that specifically. But in terms of farmers in the park bringing up sort of the fact that these projects were being funded by these like massive global polluters that were like offsetting the issue onto their farming practices. Actually, one of the things about this project that struck me was that most of the farmers that I talked to didn't really seem to know that Disney or these companies were involved or funding the project. It didn't seem like communities in the park were very aware of where the funding was coming from the people who I talked to, which is actually I actually on a different occasion spoke with the director of CI's Indigenous and Traditional Peoples program, and she mentioned that is one of the sort of more. This was 2 years ago, so I don't know if things have changed, but one of the bigger flaws of some of that organization's projects in not necessarily being the most transparent about where the money comes from, because and there are like in other circumstances, not necessarily with CI, although I don't know, but Indigenous communities and local communities that have rejected projects because who is funding them. So I think that's like an area definitely for improvement. It was just like the communication of that sort of paradox or yeah, of who is funding these projects.
Dan, here's one for you. Are the uptakes listed for land and water as of today's conditions of them? How are they measured?
Well, the numbers that I gave were the current numbers from a report that's done every year on the carbon cycle. Measuring them is really complicated and time-consuming and expensive. I mean, depending on which area you're measuring. For instance, to measure uptake of carbon from tropical forests, one way to do it. There are there are several ways, and they don't always agree with each other. That's one of the problems. But one way is to actually measure how much carbon is stored in the trunks of trees in some particular year by taking a tape measure and wrapping it around each trunk in a plot of trees, and then wait a few years because trees don't grow that quickly. So it'd be hard to measure a change of just 1 year. And then you come back and you measure it again, and you just see how the forest has changed. That's a major important way of measuring the carbon uptake or loss of a forest. I haven't done any reporting on ocean carbon uptake, so I don't really understand that. But essentially, all of these systems are measured, similar way. You just you figure out where the carbon is stored, and you tally up how much is there over time.
Belle, this one is for you. You said you photographed the natural elements first and then layer in the human aspect. How do you see photographic scale interacting with the feeling it gives people that they can make an impact?
Can you repeat that? The last part broke up.
How do you see photographic scale interacting with the feeling it gives people that they can make an impact?
Yeah, I guess that this point is somewhat on. I would like to give this idea of the people that are dealing with the natural resources in a traditional way, and trying to convey this as one of the possibilities for development. I don't know if that answers that question.
Eric, would you repeat? Oh, go ahead.
And then we have one last question here. Would carbon credits work better if they went to buy tropical forests and keep that tropical forest from being developed, and at the same time letting indigenous people live in the forest in a sustainable way?
Is that, I guess that's for me. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, rhetorically, I feel like that is sort of what the many like RED and carbon credit models are purporting to do. But I guess the questions that come up for me with that are like, in terms of buying tropical forests, like a lot of times this forest is, indigenous land, or it's already like in the case of the national park, for example. I feel like the conflict was around that, or part of it was around like that these local farmers believe that this kind of was their land, that like another party shouldn't be owning and controlling it. So there's questions around there, right? Like who owns the land that is being bought, and then who will own the bought land? And then I think in terms of letting indigenous people live in the forest in a sustainable way, that's also like a question of definition. So what happens if the project manager decides that the indigenous people are not living in the forest in a sustainable way? Then like what kind of like impositions will then enter into the picture? And so I think like like as an idea that does in some ways make sense, but I think that is how they're being talked about, and it's very clear that there's a lot of issues with thinking of countries or companies buying tropical forests, and with also defining how indigenous people or local people can live in them.
And we're just at about time for today. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all the people who made this event possible. I am so thankful to each of you, Dan Grossman, Dado Galdiari, and Blanca Beguert, for today's conversation. I also want to give a big thank you to the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication for hosting today's session. And thanks also to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, our producer for today's session. Thank you again to our audience for joining us today and for your questions. We'll see you next time.